Hello and welcome to Juicy Crimes. Well, I have a real juicy one for you today. Return guest and podcaster and author Andrea Dunlop. Welcome back to Now Juicy Crimes.
Thank you, Heather. It's such a pleasure to be a return guest. I feel very special.
You have a great podcast about a very intriguing subject of Munchausens, with mostly mothers, and it's called Nobody Should Believe Me, based on your own experience with your sister. Mm-hmm. You've had now several different seasons that cover different stories, and you reached out and was like, I got a doozy one for you, Heather. And so this is season 6. So let's get into it. What is this? Before we get to the latest one, actually, I just want to talk to you briefly. What are your feelings about the Netflix doc that has just got everyone talking in the last few weeks, which is Unknown Number or Unknown Caller, the high school catfish story about the worst cyberbullying mother in the world, also inspired to do a Lifetime movie with Lisa Rinna, which possibly by the time this airs, I will have watched it because people are like, Heather, you need to watch it now that the doc is out. But what was your thoughts when you heard about it 5 years ago? Because I know I covered it. What do you think about a mother that does that to her child?
Yeah, I mean, so I had heard briefly about the story when it broke. And then the week that the documentary came out, Unknown Number, I have probably never gotten so many messages about a documentary. Everyone was blowing me up about it. So I watched it. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Kendra Lakari, and I think the reason everyone was emailing me about it was because the police officer, like one of the detectives, or no, sorry, it wasn't one of the detectives. I think it was one of the school administrators.
Yeah, it was a really profound statement. He's like, I think this is Munchausens by cyberbullying.
Yeah.
And it made me, when I was covering it with Dr. Drew and whatnot, go, I wonder if more things in this day and age, unfortunately, is going to come out where a parent is involved, or just someone really close to you that's posing. It could be your spouse, your best friend, your sister, your neighbor, and you're being tormented by this cyberbully hater, and it could be someone that you really know. Yeah, so give me some of your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Munchausen comparison, that did feel, although like Munchausen behaviors are really sort of specifically associated with medical stuff, but this is the exact kind of behavior, and I really think it's for that same set of motivations, right, that we talk about in Munchausen by proxy cases, where you're talking about, a mother and daughter who are really enmeshed. You're talking about a mother who obviously has extraordinarily unhealthy coping mechanisms and is really doing this for the purposes of creating a crisis where she can then be one of the victims of that crisis, right? Because that was one of the things that came out. And I think I was reading elsewhere that she was, so on the school officials and sort of making this huge
find out
thing of it and really being
suffering.
like, oh, I'm on this crusade for my daughter, which of course feels very Munchausen-y. And then just in terms of like the psychological torture. I mean, one of the things that with Munchausen survivors, Munchausen by proxy survivors, although they do oftentimes have physical complications, I think the psychological torture that they're subjected to is worse. And it is that kind of thing where it's like the attempt to isolate, the creating a crisis so that you can then comfort your daughter and using that as like a way to as a sort of sick way to bond with your child, that they're having this crisis that then you can sort of be the hero of. And then of course you have this extra element of her, of the creepiness with the daughter's boyfriend, and her seeming very like inappropriately attached and inappropriately in the middle. And then I read in, I think, The Cut that she had tried to like go out to Florida for one of his baseball games or something, and you just that I think is, this is predatory behavior. And I think like it's really important that we don't, and people do not seem at all sympathetic to this mother, which is good. They shouldn't be. We should not see this as like, oh, this is like a mental illness. Like, yes, it's not mentally well behavior, but this person's a predator, someone that would do that to their own child is horrific.
Before we move on to your case, how do you feel about what has happened with Gypsy Rose since she left prison. She had a reality show, which has now been canceled, I think. I don't think she got divorced the first husband that looked like the mother, and then got with the other guy who was the father of a child. I can't remember the latest. I feel like the hype and the interest has waned, and I think she liked that publicity. So, what are your thoughts of what she should do, or what you predict will happen with her?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a complicated story because I think on the one hand, everyone who's involved in the professional side, like we all recognize that this was such a sort of unparalleled moment for visibility of this abuse, and that has made the general public much more familiar with it than they were before. And I think that's a good thing. But I've always just been so worried about her because I think going from this kind of environment where you're totally isolated with your mother and you're really being psychologically, emotionally, and physically tortured, and then going straight from that to prison, and then straight from prison to being really quite famous for a moment, just get millions of social media followers. She's doing all these interviews.
She got cute.
She had the Lifetime show. She's having these tumultuous relationships with men, and now she's has had a child. And so I just really hope for her that she finds some really good support. And I think it would be good for her if she could find a way to make a living out of the public eye. Like, it's hard to criticize her because what else is she going to do for a living right now?
You're going to just be working at like a store where everybody's coming in and talking to you. Yeah, I mean, she is very well spoken.
Yeah,
when I've heard her, on her show and in interviews.
I've spoken with her, and she's, she seems very sweet, and I just really I very much want the best for her. Obviously, she did a horrible thing, but also I think there's you cannot lose sight of the context in that one. And also, she served time. So I know people have really complicated feelings about the case, but I mean, I just hope, especially now that, she's a parent, that she can really, and her stepfather her father and her stepfather seem really lovely and supportive. I've never heard anything, seen anything about them that makes me think that they're sort of trying to go along for the ride or anything. They really do genuinely seem like a good support system. So
yeah, I definitely. It's the whole thing was just insane with all of that. But okay, let's get into what. Oh, I was going to ask. In studying about this, are there? Because I asked Dr. Drew this, and he didn't really know as far specifically for Munchausen's. Since you're like an expert. Are there ever women, because we're not really seeing the cyber bully mom take responsibility. I'm always so curious why someone does it. And when they've been found out, do they ever really admit, yeah, I did this. And yeah, I got a high off of everyone bringing me a casserole. And do they ever really take ownership that they were doing this and they were conscious when they were doing it?
It is vanishingly rare for a perpetrator to take anything like full accountability. Normally, you see them admit to what there is hard evidence of when they're sort of backed into a corner. So in these police interviews, they'll say, "Oh, I just did it the one time," or "Oh, I just was having this, really hard time for X, Y, and Z reasons," or, "I was the victim of this crime," or what have you. And so there's a lot of justification and minimization. And you saw that in the unknown number thing, right? When they had, and I was so fascinated that they got Kendra to be part of it at all. But her conversation with, her conversation in the doc, it so reminded me of my conversation with Hope Ybarra, who was convicted and did, 10 years in prison for abusing her daughter. And I met with her in person. Mm-hmm. And I met with her in person, and that was the finale of our first season. And, she did the same thing. It was so similar, right? Number one, she cried and she talked about how sorry she was without sort of talking about what she'd done, and talked about how much she loved her children, and sort of said, "Oh, well, I guess I did it because, or I think I did it because," and sort of this way of separating herself from her actions, right? And you sort of saw Kendra do the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. When she like at one point the producer suggests to her, oh, do you think you did it because you were having these body image issues and you were projecting? She goes, oh yeah, I think that. And you're like,
Yeah, like he gave her the idea.
yeah. And just sort of, that she was talking a lot about, that she brought up her assault that she said happened, which is
that what she said? I was like, I remember when she was like, and I had what did she claim happened?
She was making this very sort of mental gymnastics, justification for this horrific behavior towards her daughter that she had been, assaulted when she was sexually assaulted when she was a teenager. And that when she saw her daughter become a teenager, she was worried that it would happen to her.
I'm curious if that was, because I'm like, I needed some hard evidence of that. I needed the cousin who said if she was standing right here while I gave an interview, she'd be doing a cartwheel. I need the cousin to be like, yes, she was kidnapped on the way home from school. It was very traumatic. And, it was the 80s and we brushed it off and she never got therapy. Like, I need to know. And maybe if it was, no, I never told, well, then that's also acceptable that we know that happens as well. But I feel like she pulled that out of thin air.
Yeah. And, so I want to say a couple of things about that because this kind of thing almost always comes up in these cases, right? Where they sort of report a history of, assault or being the victim of some other crime.
The Munchausen's mom.
The Munchausen's mom. And so I think, most people would never falsely say that they were assaulted. But when you're dealing with someone like this, and especially when they're presenting it as a justification for why they did what they did, you should be sort of rightfully skeptical because there isn't any known, there are some, personality disorders like borderline personality disorder that are very tied to childhood abuse and that kind of thing and like previous trauma. Munchausen behavior and the kind of behavior that Kendra was involved in is not related to a history of trauma. So obviously sexual assault is unfortunately relatively common. So that's not to say that it didn't happen, right? But also like most people who are assaulted do not go on to do that kind of thing to their children.
In your opinion, what do you think the common denominator driving force is? Is it just attention seeking for the mother?
I actually, as I've gotten, years into deep diving these cases, and I think especially, with the one that we're going to talk about today, what I've really come to appreciate more, I think it is about sort of that attention and sympathy and narcissism of being the center of attention in your child's story. But I think it's really a lot more about power than people realize. And this is, being a parent and sort of having power over your children and their sphere, right? Talking about like moms being involved in schools and that kind of thing. That's really one of the only places that we give women full authority without question. And so I think like abusers abuse power where they find it.
That is actually really profound.
Yeah.
That's the only place we give women full authority without question.
And so abusers will abuse power where they find it. And, so when you see like male, child sex abuse, you see, it's the head of the church, it's the,
Coach.
Boy Scout leader.
Yeah.
It's someone that's close and intimate with the child, but it's like, we just don't give, historically have not given women those kind of roles. And so I think that's why they abuse. And motherhood it's such a powerful archetype, and so I think that's why people just, even when this behavior is setting off red flags, just kind of don't look at it closer because there's this knee-jerk thing of like, they just can't imagine that a mother would do that to their child. But I think it's also about, it's about power and it's about control, right? It's about being in control of the narrative.
I think also as a mom, it's such a hard job, but you look at another mother that is struggling with a child that has special needs or, my gosh, sick like this. And it's that immediate, like, that woman's a saint. Because since you were not put in that position to have to care for a child like that, as a fellow mother, you have to feel, sympathy and admiration and want to be helpful because you're like, thank you, God, that hasn't happened to me. So, and then when we find out it is a lie, then moms really get fucking pissed and are like, now, how dare you not be a good mother? Like, I think that's a big part of it. Sherry Papini, who I interviewed, who is infamously the cute blonde who was kidnapped from Redding, California, that I've had on the show. And one of the things in in her custody battle with her now ex-husband is in one of the documentaries that was out there, there was an accusation or an insinuation of a little bit of like a Munchausen's thing, which she did not want to talk about that on the interview, in which he said, my kids, she would put some cloth around their neck with alcohol to make them stay sicker or something like that. She said, no, that was essential oils, like you would put like a Bengay or whatever on their chest to let them breathe. But, so it was a lot of pointing. She was like, he was abusive and awful, and that's why I was talking to this guy who then eventually kidnapped me. That's her story now. His story is like, she was a pathological liar, and also I'm fighting for the kids because I don't feel like they're safe. And do you think there's a correlation of Munchausen's with pathological lying? As and with her, she did have real evidence that she was abused by a family member. At least her mother knew about it at the time and spoke about it.
I've not done a full deep dive on the Sherry Papini case because we are going to cover it in the future.
Okay.
So I've been hoarding, including your interview with her, hoarding all of my Sherry Papini links. But I will say that just in terms of the behaviors, I think that obviously the medical child abuse piece of it, right, which is the act of exaggerating, inducing or fabricating an illness in your child, that piece of it is something that we focus a lot because that is sort of the harm to the child. But I will say when you zoom out on these cases, and one thing I know from covering a bunch of them is that you just see the most wild behavior. I mean, when I started the show, I sort of thought, oh, this is ultimately kind of a niche topic. And then I'm like, I could do this forever because every case is they have their similarities, but then they just have these wild elements. And so what you see is that people just, the deception is the abuse, right? I mean, that is so central to the abuse. Sometimes they're doing physical stuff, but it really is, characterized by intentional deception. And what you see is that the perpetrators are lying about everything to everyone all the time. So you don't just see it about medical stuff. You see, they're claiming to have been victims of crimes that didn't happen, sort of fake 911 call type of things. You see them lying about their work credentials. So much financial fraud, so much scamming. And so I think in terms of the sort of broader group of behaviors, it's this cluster B stuff. So narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, those kind of behaviors. So, and I think there's a range of them, some of them are not, some of them don't get to the level of the cases that I talk about on the show, but you really do see just pervasive deception. And the other thing we see a lot of is affairs. And to an extreme.
So the women are having the affairs too? God, yes. How do you have time to do all this?
I mean, because they are not working. I think it's because scamming is their full-time job. I've covered numerous cases where, it came out that the woman was having not an affair with a coworker, but a bunch, so this sort of
almost like a sex addict too.
Yeah, and I think it's it really comes down to this type of psychopathology is they have low impulse control, and they're really just sort of opportunistic and they like pulling one over on people. I mean, I think that's what, my psychiatrist and psychologist colleagues talk about is that part of it is, whereas for people who are not like this, most of us are really uncomfortable lying. Right. If somebody tells you have to go, if you were lying about if I sat here and just lied to you about my whole life story, I would be sweating, I would be panicking, I'd be looking over weird, but because it makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But for these people, they're right in their sweet spot. So that does not make them uncomfortable and it gives them a thrill. And so I think, you look at these of well, how do people pull this off and why do they seem so credible? It's because when you're talking to them one-on-one, they don't act like a person who's lying. They're not being shifty and kind of, they have this intense compartmentalization about they know they're lying. They're not delusional. They're culpable for their actions. But they're able to sort of behave like it's the truth in the moment. And so I think, and I think they can be very convincing, and it's sort of why you really have to, every time I'm reaching out to a perpetrator or talking to one, it's oh, I really have to know my facts going in because they'll just, they will tell you a very convincing story every time. It's there's a sort of reality distortion field around them.
Yeah. I did reach out to Sherry Papini afterwards because I had one question. And she'd reached out to me to say, "Oh, I did another podcast and thought of you," or something. I was like, "Okay, do them all, girl. I don't really, it's fine." But I said, "Oh, I forgot to ask you about your haircut. That you showed up afterwards and the hair was cut, but it wasn't a terrible haircut. It wasn't shaved. It was like a bob." And I'm like, "Why would your former boyfriend / kidnapper, if he was just into S&M kind of stuff and keeping you hostage, doing that kind of sexual assault of you, where does the hair cutting come in?" Because I don't remember that from 50 Shades of Grey. And so I'm like, I think the hair, if you want to not believe her or believe part of it is that, yeah, she cut the hair to either look different or add to the abuse or something. Anyway, she didn't write me back.
It's going to be really interesting to see how that unfolds, and I'm going to be very interested
It could still
dig into this whole case.
Let's get into this case. Season 6 of Nobody Should Believe Me. This is the woman. What is her name?
So this is Lisa McDaniel. So she is a mother of 3, and the reason I reached out to you about this case is because this story, which I've known for several years, I've known this family for quite a while. We reported the story with Lisa's eldest daughter, Michelle, who very bravely came forward to talk about this. And so this had really been years in the making. And this is just, of all the stories I've covered, I've never seen someone who's gotten away with it at this level. So Lisa McDaniel was convicted of abusing her middle daughter, Angeline. And the details of this conviction, the details of this case were some of the most extreme that I've seen and some of the most straightforward, because this was, they do use covert video surveillance in these cases, which they did, which is, they put them in a hospital room where there's video surveillance.
Does every hospital room have video surveillance?
No, not every hospital has video surveillance. And this is something that's actually come up in another case that's happening in San Diego that people, that's, subject to this big lawsuit. And people are, have, I think, some strong reactions to the idea that there would be video surveillance in a hospital room. But I think people need to remember, hospitals are not private spaces.
I think that they should.
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe,
for a lot of reasons.
Maybe not if you're getting a sponge bath or something like that. Obviously not where but for the protection of the medical profession when there's so many malpractice suits. And then, of course, the patient protection. And then maybe if someone was accusing you of, being Munchausens and you weren't. So,
right.
They're not expensive. You could have a Ring camera in every room of your house. Why not have it in every classroom and in every hospital?
I 100% agree with you. And I think people should definitely be aware of how much pushback there is on that. There's a lot of pushback there's a lot of pushback from parents' rights groups right now that are making it in myriad ways harder to catch and prosecute abuse. But so with this case,
what city are we in and what year is this and how old is the child?
Yes. So we are in Hazelhurst, Georgia, which is a pretty small rural town in southeast Georgia. And the child is a baby when this is happening. So very familiar trajectory from these cases where she was born severely premature and so did have some existing issues when she was born. Now, something that comes up a lot in these cases because you have, not only a lot of premature births, and just to say, premature births by themselves are not a red flag. Premature birth is common. But when it comes to one of these cases, we have had perpetrators who have spoken about the fact that they induced a premature birth. And because of sort of this overall trajectory.
Oh my God, right from the start?
Yeah.
They wanted a preemie?
Yes,
have that kind of medical attention?
Well, because then you have, if a child's born, especially if they're born, sort of 26, 27 weeks, really early, they're going to have legitimate issues. So then you're causing the child to have legitimate issues.
That's crazy that someone is thinking about it and planning it when the baby's in utero.
Well, I think, it's because this behavior, and whether it's explicitly about medical stuff or just this, the stuff with Lisa was just, because we also spoke to her younger sister for the show. And, just there was a long history of deception. So the behaviors start before they have children, inevitably. I've never talked to...
But with her first child, who then spoke with you, she was not abused.
She was not medically abused. She was abused in other ways, but she was not the target of abuse. And I've seen that in a couple of other cases. The Hope Bar case was the same. For some reason, the first child wasn't medically abused, and then the second child was a little bit, and then the third child got it the worst. So I do think it's this behavior. I think Dr. Drew was talking about this the other day, right, about how these behaviors function like addiction, where they have to sort of keep one-upping it and keep doing something more, more dangerous, more extreme to get that same sort of high that they're getting from it. And I think that sort of fits the bill. But so she had, they had this child who was having all of these breathing issues and had a tracheostomy and was having all these gastrointestinal issues, just a lot of the stuff that you see in these cases. And, they kept going into the hospital, and they were, driving out to Savannah, and she was staying at the Ronald McDonald house, and it was this whole thing. And they were telling family members that they thought she was going to die. And, her husband later testified that they were, that they were shopping for a dress for the child to be buried in. I mean, just very, very unnerving. And what came out after they put her, some of the nurses suspected, and we actually talked to one of the nurses who'd cared for Angelin, that they suspected that the mom might be causing it, and they put her in this video surveillance room, and they caught 50 instances during the time period they were videoing her. 50 instances of her either attempting to suffocate the child or injecting substances into her IV. And she was going septic, and she nearly died a couple of times.
What kind of, what was she trying to put in the IV?
She was putting feces in the IV. Yeah, that was what they caught on
So she took a shit.
Well, the child had a diaper. Yeah.
And then was and you can open
yeah,
it
so
or
there
something?
there was videotape of her, because I haven't actually, I've seen the transcript of the videotape, but I haven't actually watched it, which, is probably better for me and my mental health. But Sabrina, the child's aunt and Lisa's younger sister, had seen the video, and she described her going down into the diaper and putting stuff in, and then also having something that she brought along with her.
Oh my God!
Yeah, and
how old was the baby during those instances?
18 months. Yeah, so little baby, and so she was caught. She was arrested. She was sentenced to 8 months. That's how much she served. So she's given 6 months to a year. She served 8 months in a women's detention facility.
What happened to the baby?
So the baby went into medical foster care for a while. And then once she was well enough, her and her older sister, Michelle, went to live with Lisa's parents, who were protective and recognized that the abuse was happening. They never defended. In some of these situations, you'll see, parents or grandparents, really stick up for the perpetrator. I think in this case, probably it helped that it was so straightforward. It wasn't kind of one of these more complicated cases that you have to kind of walk someone through. I think it's pretty obvious without any context of Munchausen by proxy that that's not an okay thing to do to a child. So they were with them for a time. And basically, after Lisa got out, she and her husband, Carrie, who, by the way, had been sitting in the room while she was doing this to the child.
The husband was?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think? Did he know?
Yeah, I strongly believe he knew. And he has stood by her for, just in every circumstance over decades. So yeah, I think
are they still together?
They're still together.
So he loses his 2 kids,
mm-hmm.
visits her in jail for 6 months,
mm-hmm.
and she gets out.
So she gets out, and then she lobbies relentlessly to get her kids back. And she has another child, her son, Colin, in 2002.
Here's the photo. Okay, so the dad is named
Carrie.
The mom is
Lisa.
This oldest daughter is...
That's Michelle, who was with us on the season.
She's the oldest daughter who then went to live with the grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
This blonde girl with the glasses was the preemie baby who was
that's
victim.
Angelin. Yeah.
And then this is the newest boy.
And that's Colin.
Colin. So while they're living with the grandmother, they were able to have visits or supervised visits to have taken this Christmas photo.
So they were having supervised visits, but probably by the time that this photo was taken, they were actually all reunited. So basically,
And living back with the mom.
and living back with the mom. So
And how did the parents feel about that? Were they just hopeful and because they didn't, or how hard did they fight to have it not happen?
I mean, I think they really tried to keep the girls in their house, and they certainly recognized that. Lisa was not a safe parent. But the state did not. The state, the judge originally in the case said that Lisa's rights should be terminated, but they never were. And I think that's something that would surprise most people about child abuse cases. You can go to jail for child abuse and not have your rights terminated. That's not an automatic thing. That's an extra step that the court has to take, or someone has to sort of like lobby for it. But, despite that, when CPS got involved when, after Colin was born, because obviously this is a person who's not living with her children because of abuse, they just kind of got in there, and there was the state filed for what's called deprivation, which means like take custody of the child away. A judge dismissed it, and then basically everyone said like, all right, well, that's it. And so then once she had Colin and had custody, she just really started lobbying to get the girls back. And, Michelle talked about she wanted to be back with her parents. I think one of the most heartbreaking things about these cases, and you sort of saw it in Unknown Number, right, where she's talking about missing her mom. It's like, well, yeah, the children, the perpetrators don't feel any real bond with the children, right? They're treating them as objects to get what they want. But the children feel a strong bond to their parents too, just like we all do. It's primal. It's survival, right? You have to depend on your parents to survive. And so I think just the parents just dealing with this relentless pressure. And I think that's what people kind of underestimate about these perpetrators is they are relentless about getting what they want on a level that most of us just would not. Sort of they will go to such extremes, right? And so they just kept petitioning the courts, and they finally got custody, I think, of Michelle back first, and then eventually Angelin. And then, by this time, I think they were all living back under the same roof.
And what are they doing to make money to survive as a family?
Mostly getting money from other people. So Carrie was at one point
the dad.
Carrie, the dad, was a pastor at a church. Lisa, Lisa was in an MLM. But as I'm sure 99% of people who are in MLMs do not make any money. Although I will say, with how scammy MLMs are, if there was going to be someone in that 1%, it was probably Lisa. But we don't think she probably made any significant income from that.
Okay.
And you see this pattern, early on of. There are so many people, family members, people from the church. Churches, unfortunately, make such a mark for these perpetrators because they're so used to that idea of community and giving and helping people and really calling for, donations if someone has a crisis. And that really gets taken advantage of in these cases. So they got a lot of money from people at church. Money from the grandparents.
But what was the crisis now? How old was the boy when he suddenly gets sick?
Yeah. So a few years after the last sort of involvement from the state, Colin at age 5, I want to say. I think he was yes, age 5. So Colin, when he's about 5, allegedly, according to Lisa, has this incident where he wakes up and he can't see. And
can't see.
Okay. And so she takes him in, and they start off on this sort of diagnostic odyssey, where she is, trying to figure out what's going on with her son. And Lisa at this time starts a blog right away. So one of these caregiver blogs where, you see these, this one was on Caring Bridge. So, these sites that are meant to keep family members involved, or they serve a good purpose, right? So, but obviously in this context, they're very creepy. So this blog was in total, it went for the entire 4 years, and it was 170,000 words long. So a couple times the size of a book. Mm-hmm. So extremely lengthy, extremely detailed in terms of treatments and medications and all of that. And so she gets him this diagnosis of neuromyelitis optica, which is a rare autoimmune condition that affects the myelin on nerves. So it can cause a variety of symptoms. It's characterized by, people will have lesions in their brain or spinal cord. And it can have kind of this, it can be very, very serious. There is much better treatment for it now. And actually there was pretty decent treatment for it at the time, but it can cause, people to go blind. It can cause disability. It is a serious condition, and it's a relapsing condition. So you would have like an attack, and then you kind of recover, and then have another one. And so she gets this diagnosis. It's in this vanishingly rare diagnosis, and then it's even rarer in children, and even rarer in male children, and even rarer than that in white male children. So just,
and
right
even
away.
rarer in that redheads.
I don't know if there's any.
Redhead
they are.
Family.
I know everyone's redheaded.
Okay.
So already you have this setup where you have someone who is a convicted perpetrator, and just to say, like, this is not, you were asking earlier about sort of, do people ever take accountability for this? And I've heard of one or two cases where people really took accountability and entered some successful treatment. And, my colleagues on the psychiatrist side have a treatment model. And the very first step is taking full accountability. And Lisa in no way took accountability for what she did to Angelin. She minimized it. She got some psychiatrist to say that she didn't have Munchausen by proxy. I mean, it was just,
the first case.
With the first case,
Okay.
where you have this very straightforward evidence. So she never took accountability for that behavior.
So is he
she was not
blind
in
at
treatment.
this point?
No. So
Okay.
his family members, and just to say, like, we do not have access to Colin's medical records.
Okay.
However, we have this lengthy blog from Lisa, and what we do have is, recollections from the family. None of the family members remember him having any issues with his eyesight. And then you have, all of these periods. So immediately, she gets this diagnosis of neuromyelitis optica, and then he's being treated with steroids. And then immediately they just go to, she's pushing for sort of the next most extreme treatment, and this treatment and that treatment. And he's never, he's just getting worse and worse. And he's never has any good days. And she starts talking about death really early. About 5 months after his diagnosis, she starts talking about hospice care, which is obviously a huge red flag and really common in these cases where you see a parent who is talking about death for something that is not a terminal illness. So NMO is not a terminal diagnosis. It can be really serious. It can have, people do sometimes die from an attack, right? If they have like a respiratory failure during an attack, is I think the most common way. But like, it's not something where, it's not like getting a leukemia diagnosis where you have, X amount of years to live. And so obviously really alarming that she's talking about death, and especially with all sort of the context. And so basically, this poor little boy is given all of these, treatments, and then she's taking him for the first period of time to the same hospital in Savannah where she was caught, abusing her daughter. And so some people catch on, right? And we talked to one of the nurses who worked there who, saw his name and, on the board in the PICU and was like, oh my God, McDaniel. And so you did have people, calling in these concerns. And then, under a year into the diagnosis, Lisa moves the entire family to Alabama, to Birmingham, to be close to this doctor, Dr. Jane Ness from University of Alabama and Children's of Alabama, she is an expert in NMO. But of course, that move was, we eventually found out that move was sort of directly tied to Lisa getting questions at the hospital. And, and then it's like sort of the next day she's emailing a relative and saying that they're going to move. So she moves across state line. Again, another really common thing with these perpetrators, right? Like if, the heat's on,
go to a new hospital.
Just get new hospital, new community, right? No one's asking questions. Because obviously news of her first conviction, this is a very small town that she was living in, Hazelhurst, Georgia, everyone knew. And so, it's obviously like, even if people aren't super familiar with.
So she takes the whole family, the husband,
family.
the two girls,
Mm-hmm.
and they go how far away from their original house?
Oh gosh. a geography
I
question.
mean, just approximate.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's like a, 10, 12-hour drive. I mean,
okay.
it's
like significant.
decently far
Yeah.
away. Yeah. So again, not close to family members, not close
Okay.
to the support system. So they take them to this new community, and unfortunately, this doctor just gets completely enmeshed with Lisa, and they get, very involved. And I think she's just was really, wrapped around her finger. And that was one of the most interesting things we got with the season, was that Michelle had recorded a conversation with herself and Dr. Jane Ness, asking her about Colin.
Wait, who's Michelle now?
Michelle is the older sister. Yeah,
Oh,
the older
okay.
sister. So
How old is she then when she does?
she was a teenager. So she was.
Was she starting to get suspicious?
Yes. And she, sort of kept trying to bring it to attention, but I think she just didn't, she's also obviously extremely traumatized by
Right.
everything that had been happening in her family. And what the family members described to me was that they were concerned, but he appeared to have this very legitimate diagnosis from a very legitimate doctor. And, even the nurse who we spoke to at the time that it was happening said she kind of felt like, oh, well, like that's just like really bad luck that parent ends up having a sick child, right? Because there was,
Right.
when you think like, oh, well, if the doctors, and this is an assumption a lot of people make, right? Well, if the doctors are giving that diagnosis, well, then okay, he must really have it.
Yeah.
So I think they were concerned, but they I think suspected she was making it worse, but they were, did believe that was a real diagnosis.
So the daughter records a conversation between the doctor and the mom, Lisa.
No, so this is actually much later on that she ends up following up with this doctor.
Oh,
But
okay.
at the time when this is all happening, there are all of these incredibly, and I know some of this from, from reading. Again, we don't have the medical records, and Lisa's not a reliable narrator, but in her blog, she's talking about all of these treatments he's getting and how she's pushing for him to have this treatment that he could die from, and she's upset when they don't get it, which is a huge red flag. And then you see all of this stuff that really doesn't have anything to do with his diagnosis. So you see him coming in to the hospital with a bunch of blood infections, and so you have these polymicrobial blood infections, which is when you have multiple organisms in the blood, and it's very very much a red flag for Munchausen by proxy, just kind of all by itself, right? Because if you can't figure out why the child has a blood infection, and he had, because
And
of
how
his
would she have
treatments-
done that?
Well, he had a port.
Oh.
Yeah.
So she could have put something in there.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, she's already been caught on video doing the same thing to her daughter. So there's really no question of whether she's capable of it. And so you have, numerous instances of him coming into the emergency room with sepsis and almost died a couple of times. And then you have this other trajectory that is so ubiquitous in these cases, where you just see all of this stuff about gastrointestinal issues. So, he can't eat, and he can't keep food down, and he,
Needs a feeding
he
tube.
ends up getting a feeding tube, first through the nose, and then the gastro tube through the stomach. And that, again, has nothing to do with NMO. Like, it can cause, people can have sort of vomiting reactions during attacks sometimes, but it's not this this ongoing sort of gastrointestinal issues are atypical. And so as I'm reading this, you just think, how are the doctors not catching on? And then I found out that Dr. Jane Ness, who is this treating physician, had gotten a call from the doctor in Savannah that they were concerned about Colin, and that Lisa had this previous conviction. So she knew that Lisa had been convicted for abusing her daughter. But to our knowledge, no one ever reports once they're in Alabama. And Lisa, in early 2012, starts to take things to the end of the line. And it's this period right before where actually Colin, it's the longest she ever goes dark on the blog. And she, talks about like, oh, Colin's actually doing better. And, this is the longest he's ever gone without having an attack. And then suddenly she starts the blog back up at the end of 2011. And suddenly things have taken this sort of mysterious, dire turn. And then she brings in January, hospice care, like end of life hospice care. And again, not something that makes any sense for the diagnosis that he has. And, she is planning his funeral and she's choosing a coffin and, posting constantly on Facebook and sort of saying, oh, this is the last family picture we'll ever have with him. And, just very, very disturbing behavior online. And in March, he passes away.
In March of 2011?
2012.
And so then what happens? So they have a big funeral.
Yeah. So they have, a big funeral there in Alabama, and then they have one in Hazelhurst. And then Lisa really proceeds to make her...
So he dies at how old?
9 years old.
Oh, so for 4 years he was going through this hell?
Yeah.
And during that time, they're living off of the pastor and being a pastor and like donations
getting
and stuff?
So much money from other people. I mean, one of the things that's happened, so we had, and Sabrina, Lisa's sister, told us a lot about some of this fundraising that she'd done. So we've heard from so many people since our first episodes on this aired who had donated money to Lisa. So she was just getting money from everyone. She was given a free house in Alabama. That was one of the things we found, was that this deed to this house had been given to them for $0. So they just got someone to give them a house to live in. And, it's just people.
And were you able to get a hold of the person that gave them the house? Like, were they so wealthy and they didn't care? Or?
We haven't actually. I had so many leads I could have followed on this one. I didn't actually track that down beyond finding them. But that would be interesting actually to check in with them and say like, hey, what was your? I mean, I assume it had something to do with this poor family that's had to move here for their child's illness. But I mean, she was just getting money from it. Again, Carrie, has a job here and there, but he didn't. I don't know that he ever took up being a pastor again after.
Were they making enough money from the scamming everybody that they were like just surviving, or were they actually like living a nice life?
No, they were living a nice life. I mean, I remember, Michelle saying, and they were all saying like, oh, they got this really nice house in Birmingham that was like, that was like a big upgrade from their last house. And they were taking like a lot of trips. And that was the other thing that she did a lot of, was like, they went on a Make-A-Wish trip to Disneyland, and they did this whole thing with like NASCAR where they got to meet all the drivers. And so
when he was still living.
Yes. So they were doing a lot of stuff. And then the other thing that, Lisa, right away when Colin gets diagnosed, there happened to be a very high-profile family who had a child who got this diagnosis about a month before Colin was diagnosed in February of 2008, and then Colin was diagnosed in March of 2008.
So Victoria Jackson, who I remember from the makeup days of having the 1-800 infomercial, and she was already a rich woman before that.
Yes. And then she's married to Bill Guthey, who is one half of Guthey Ranker,
right.
Who is also infomercial. I think they met actually at an industry thing.
Okay.
She's written about. So they were both, sort of the infomercial king and queen of California. So his brands, Proactive and When Hair Care, and like, it's like those Proactive commercials are like embedded in my brain as a millennial. But so they're a very wealthy family. So their daughter gets this diagnosis, and they, right away start the Guthey Jackson Charitable Foundation and, funnel just like a ton of their personal wealth towards research. And they start, this sort of patient community. And so Lisa connects with them really early on and is at their first, every year they have several of these patient days where they bring all of the patients together so they can talk to the doctors and sort of have this community. So Lisa gets attached to this right away. And, they end up filming Colin and the family for like some of their promotional materials. And so she just becomes very embedded in this foundation right away. And she's connected with them throughout the duration of Colin's illness. And then she starts volunteering for them after his death. And she eventually gets hired by the foundation after his death.
Okay.
And she was there. She eventually became their director of patient advocacy and was working there for 13 years, almost 13 years, until I called them in May.
Until who called them?
Until I called them.
You called them?
Mm-hmm. So,
oh my God.
They had no idea that she had this previous conviction, and they had no idea that this illness and death were highly, highly suspicious. And
did their daughter, was their daughter still living?
yes, their daughter's doing great. So they, and one of the things when we talk to experts, even if Colin really had NMO, which is very suspect because there was a whole bunch of stuff about the testing. Michelle ended up talking to this doctor who said that she had no idea, really didn't know what he had.
Yeah.
And had, so much of it was very atypical for NMO. But the, Ali Guthie, the Victoria and Bill's daughter, is actually, she's doing great. And they've done really, Guthie Jackson really has done a lot for, moving the treatment forward, moving the research forward. And unfortunately, they just got pulled in by Lisa. And this is something that we're seeing happen a lot, is that these perpetrators find these rare disease organizations, they embed themselves in there, get help from these foundations. This is really the furthest I've seen someone take it in terms of making their entire life about their dead child. And she built a career off of it. And I mean, that was, she was getting opportunities to just talk about his death constantly, basically, because that was how, she was positioning herself as this like heroic caregiver advocate.
So this is a pretty cushy job.
Yeah.
And was she getting paid a a couple $100,000 a year salary?
I don't know what her salary was,
okay.
But it's certainly, she's still living in rural Georgia, so I'm sure it goes a lot longer than, a lot further than here. Out here. But it was certainly also just prestigious, and she got to position herself as an expert, by the. In the page about her on the foundation, which is obviously no longer there, but it said she'd educated tens of thousands of professionals about NMO. And she was running the support groups, and she was, just very, very embedded in this organization, which is really terrifying, because the other thing that we've seen a lot of in these cases is that perpetrators will find each other. And when you have a disease like this, unfortunately, something like a rare autoimmune condition that can have this sort of variety of symptoms, and it's not that well understood, and there's only you have to go to these sort of specialists, is just ripe for exploitation, right, by these perpetrators. And so they do find these, rare conditions. And so it's really scary that Lisa got herself so embedded.
When you say they find each other, you meaning two Munchausen's moms will find each other?
Yeah. So and
then do they ever admit, I'm a munch, or do they just play along? What is it?
I think they keep them
Is it like when pedophiles get together?
Yeah, I think it's similar. And it's, it's something that I've just have noticed. And what was interesting in this case in particular was that way back during the first conviction, which was a very different time on the internet, Lisa was on the message boards of this, is now defunct, but has been around for a long time, of this Mothers Against Munchausen allegations, which was started by someone who was, investigated for Munchausen and is very much known as a sort of perpetrator-centric place.
Someone who was found guilty of Munchausen's started the Munchausen.
I'd have to look back at that case in specific, but that was when it came from a high profile investigator, someone who was had a high profile investigation who I think whose child died. But it was this
also
message board where a whole bunch of people are coming saying they've been falsely accused of Munchausen.
Falsely accused. Okay.
Right. Well, that's the
the documentary Saving Maya.
Take Care of Maya. Well, I did my whole third season on that, and I do not think that was a false accusation at all.
You don't think it was?
No.
You do think she was sick?
Do I think that I think abuse was happening? Yeah.
Oh no, you do think it was abusive?
Yeah.
Because they did win their civil trial.
Yeah, I mean that's going to appeal.
Okay.
But I mean that's such a whole other rabbit hole. But I mean I read thousands and thousands of court documents in that case, and
I thought I talked a little bit about that. Maybe it was with you, or I listened to yours. For those that you don't know, it was a huge documentary, and it was about a woman who, was saying her daughter was sick and she was being accused of Munchausen's, and then the mother ended her own life, and then the family went after all the doctors to say you falsely accused her. And I thought, what a dangerous situation this is, because it's see something, say something.
Yeah.
in any case, see something, say something. But if you see something, say something, it looks shady. Well, then you're a racist or a Karen or both.
Yeah.
And then if you do this, you could lose your medical license. So,
Yeah.
but then if you don't do something, you're a bad doctor and you're not
Right.
following the oath of keeping people healthy.
Yeah. Well, and in that case, right, there was actually a really interesting sort of, I'm talking about this, where you see, perpetrators kind of finding each other online or finding these resources to pull off what they're pulling off. And so that diagnosis of CRPS, the condition that she claimed that Maya Kowalski had, she had, Maya had been evaluated by 3 world-class hospitals that gave her the diagnosis of conversion disorder, which is when you are having physical symptoms, but it's because of a psychological issue. It doesn't mean you're faking it or it's all in your head or whatever, but it's a real thing. But they were, nobody gave her that diagnosis of CRPS. And then, Beata Kowalski found, a patient of hers mentioned that something about CRPS. And then, Beata Kowalski went and found this online group and messaged with another parent. And she said, "Oh, I think my daughter has CRPS." And she goes, "Oh, okay, go to Dr. Kirkpatrick. He'll give you the diagnosis," basically. And then she goes to this ketamine, kind of strip mall doctor and gets this diagnosis. Right. So, I mean, it's just incredibly suspect. And we've just seen a lot of that where, where perpetrators are. Yeah. And in that case, just to sort of close the loop on that quickly, because that is one that I continue to talk about, there was strong evidence of abuse. You had another situation where the mom was blogging, right? She kept this blog in Maya's voice, which I have read, and it was, again, a constant talk of death for something that's not a terminal illness. She was taking her to Mexico to have this ketamine coma procedure where there was a 50% chance of death. I cannot imagine, and then when she took her to Johns Hopkins and they wouldn't give her this massive dose of ketamine that she was requesting, she said, "Well, then I'll just take her home and put her in hospice care so she can finally die." And how people sort of looked at these facts, and
and that daughter lived, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, Maya Kowalski. Yeah, she
was part of the case to win $20 million or whatever, $200 million.
Oh, yeah, 220 was the final verdict, which I think got down to 206. But I think that is very much a TBD situation, but because that's all still kind of playing out. And I think what I hope people will recognize is that case has, number one, opened the door for similar lawsuits, which there are a couple of, and
of people claiming to be falsely accused of Munchausens. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the point of that movement is to overturn protections for mandatory reporters, that people, on this sort of extreme parents' rights and just I believe don't think that the state has any business intervening in child abuse cases. And, right now you're supposed to be protected as a mandatory reporter, right? So that you report a reasonable suspicion of abuse, right? Because you don't,
because you're a teacher,
and then
a
you
nurse.
do, right. And then they do an investigation to determine whether, and then a judge has to sign off on it. So it's being characterized as oh, these doctors are just taking children away. Doctors don't have any authority to do that. They're not that powerful. And I think this big sort of anti-science, anti-medicine backlash that we're in is kind of affecting all of this as well. But I think how that case plays out is going to have a big impact on how safe children are. And it already has, it's already creating this chilling effect. And I think, we see in this case, right, where so Michelle,
the daughter,
Michelle, the daughter, who's now in her 30s, ended up calling Dr. Jane Ness, who treated her brother, and just expressing to her that she had been really haunted by, these questions around her brother's death. And that doctor said that she wasn't sure what Colin really had, and that she had suspected abuse. That all of these things that I was reading about, the polymicrobial sepsis infections and and all the gastrointestinal, all this stuff that didn't fit, and just that he wasn't responding to any of these treatments, and that she knew about the previous conviction, and that they had talked about this in the hospital, and somehow they didn't report, and the child died. And it's such a tragic story, and the worst part is that Lisa now lives with her middle daughter and her 2 children.
with the original abused child and her 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
So she, by your call, she was let go at the Victoria Jackson charity.
Yes. So I, as soon as I had kind of wrapped up my investigation, and I was obviously also reaching out to them for comment, but, obviously wanted to tell them before the podcast came out. And so I've had some back and forth with them. They did fire her. I'm a little concerned at this time about the lack of response beyond that, because we very quickly heard, very quickly once the show came out, started hearing from patients and caregivers in that community that no one had told them about Lisa being fired or why she was fired. And so she was continuing to, this is back in June after the first episodes aired. Lisa was continuing to contact patients that she'd known through Gypsy Jackson and telling them that she was on leave because her husband had cancer.
Oh, God.
So
the husband and her both still, are they there, the grandparents all living with the original sick daughter and now her 2 children?
Yeah.
In Georgia.
Yeah. And they left to go and be closer to a sick relative, which is obviously alarming.
How have they responded to you, knowing that you're doing this hardcore investigation?
Yeah, so actually, and I'm covering this with, I am also covering this with a local television journalist in Georgia whose coverage is going to come out here in the next few weeks. So we went to Georgia in May and to film some stuff with the family, and then we actually, this journalist and I, Meredith Anderson, we actually drove out and knocked on Lisa's door. And so she did not agree to be interviewed, but we talked to her on her doorstep for about 45 minutes. And, I really wanted to, obviously I'm always interested to hear what people will say, but I also wanted to give her a chance if there was something that I was missing. Obviously this one, from the outside, you sort of think, well, yeah, this sort of so obviously looks like abuse, but you never, I never assume, and I always want to do just like I never want to miss anything. I want to tell the most complete story I can. And so we, spoke to her at length, and it was fascinating. Carrie at some point came out,
the husband.
Yes. So as soon as we sort of told her that we were there, not just to talk about Angeline, but also because there were questions about Colin. She texted her husband, and he came out.
Who's Angeline?
Angeline's the daughter.
The daughter. Okay, yeah.
Right. Because when we sort of first approached her, and she knew who I was because Michelle had actually told her months before that she was doing this podcast and kind of gave her a heads up. And so,
and what does she say to her daughter? Like, what the fuck what are you doing why would you do that to me?
Yeah.
Does she say that?
Just tried so hard to make her feel guilty, and you're tearing our family apart, and I'm going to lose my job and this and that, and just blaming her for everything, and just saying like, oh, I've worked so hard to overcome my past actions. And just, again, that's just minimizing and
so
justifying.
She's never admitting that she did anything nefarious with Colin.
No, not thus far. And it was very interesting to talk to her because, I had spent probably months to sort of years at that point, kind of going through all of this, going through her blog, going through all of these, sources and everything else. And, she said, well, his doctors had my back 100%. And I told her, well, actually we spoke to, Dr. J. Ness, or we heard this conversation with Dr. J. Ness, and she said she didn't know what he had. And then she said like, well, what about the positive test that came back? And it was this whole thing with like, this was kind of my, and not to be glib about it, but this was kind of my, Elle Woods moment where she's like,
yeah,
the ammonium thioglycolate in perm, because there was this like wild goose chase that I went on trying to track down this like, she said like months after Colin's death, oh, we just got these test results back. And actually he did have NMO because he had negative tests for it before. And that's a whole complicated thing. But, so she said, well, what about this positive test? And I was like, oh, well, the one that was taken in the blood draw right before he passed away. And she said, yeah. And I was like, well, you posted about that 8 months later. And actually there's no window where you would get test results in that, in that way. And like that, that was taken for a study. So they don't give individual diagnostics. And she's like, kind of tried to argue and then just let it go. But yeah, it was, and she said at one point, this really kind of stuck with me. She said, towards the end, and at one point she said, "Oh, well, what would it take to put the questions about Colin's death to rest?" And she goes, "What do you want? His MRIs? You want his medical records?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I mean, that would, that would do it." And I said,
Yeah.
"But I'd need a complete medical record and a HIPAA release so that I could speak to his doctors." And then her husband said, "Oh, well, you'd never have time to read all of that." And I was like, "I would. I'd make time." And she said it, and she was like, "Well, we're not going to do that." And she said at one point to me, she said, "I know how this looks, but he really was sick." And I just said, "You're right. That is how it looks," sort of implying that she had something to do with this death. And I said, "If there's something else that you have that you think I should see, if there's something else you think I should know, if there's someone you want me to talk to that makes it look otherwise, like, now's the time."
Wow. Well, thank you so much for coming. This is juicy, and thank you for doing what you do. I feel like, the first time the world really even thought or knew about this was when we saw it in the movie The Sixth Sense,
Right.
which was like
The Misha Barton ghost.
25
Yeah.
years ago or
Yeah.
so, and that the mom was making her sick. And, so this is just a fascinating subject. And so it's season 6 of Nobody Should Believe Me. So great. Where can everyone follow you and everything?
Yeah. So the only social media I'm really on anymore is Instagram. And you can find the show Nobody Should Believe Me wherever you listen to podcasts. And
Is the whole season out?
Yeah,
or
so
just
the
a few?
whole season's out.
Okay.
But because there is so much happening, like, we are staying on it. So
Okay.
we're still kind of
Adding
releasing new
okay,
episodes in
good.
batches, and we're really hoping that there will be a criminal investigation into this death.
Yeah.
Because that's what needs to happen. That's the only way that, that we'll ever sort of really know the truth.
And how does that initial call happen when you call the foundation? Like, "Hi, who do I speak to about one of the people working for you as Munchausens and is a convicted child abuser?"
Yeah, I mean,
Hold, please.
It was
How does that even begin?
It's an uncomfortable phone call to make. I eventually got, a number for Victoria's office and spoke to one of her representatives and sort of said, I'm calling about a really serious situation with one of your employees. Like, are you the person to tell this information to? And, I just sort of told her the high level, there was this previous conviction. Here was what it was for. And also there's a lot of questions about Colin's illness and death and et cetera. And so, they did, in terms of Lisa's employment there, they obviously, they did take that seriously. And I've followed up with them with questions about, I think, like, what's unclear to me at this point is if there is, sort of some deeper soul searching in that organization about what it means to have, because, it appears they did not do a background check on her. So obviously that's not great, and you should,
Yeah.
but honestly, it's a forgivable error because they'd known her as a parent.
Right.
They knew her as a volunteer. This was someone that they trusted. This was someone that they'd had good experiences with. We all do that. I mean,
Right.
it's like, who hasn't, right? It's like, are we all thoroughly investigating? No,
Yeah.
it's like, that's just not how anybody looks at things. But I think the thing at this point is, if you've had someone like this involved in your organization for that many years, they've had an impact on the organization. Yeah. And it's also very traumatizing for this community who cared about this little boy, who have been going to Lisa as their advocate, who've been sharing their medical records with her, who've, really relied on this person to then find out that she's done all these things.
Wow.
Is just horrible. And so I think it kind of, and I just think it's like anybody who's working for this kind of rare disease organizations, unfortunately, they are such a target for these perpetrators that you have to be really careful. And it's not what anybody wants to do. Nobody wants to look at the world, and I don't wish the lens I have on the world on anyone.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to suspect that people would
Right,
do
are
this.
that
And of course,
evil.
like most parents who say they have a sick child, they do have a sick child. Most parents would never do this. This is an
Right.
aberration, but it's not so rare that you don't need to watch out for it.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And everyone follow Nobody Should Believe Me and Andrea Dunlop. And thank you. Thank you. And of course, everything for me is at heathermcdonald.net. My live show November 14th in Vegas, as well as following Juicy Scoop and joining me on Patreon. You do that at heathermcdonald.net. Thank you.